Okay, in this video, we're still in chapter 4. We've talked about looping a couple different ways. We've talked about while loops, do while loops, and for loops. In this section, we're going to talk about file input and output. This is actually a really important part of programming, and that is, yes, up till now we've been entering data by hand using the keyboard, but at the end of the day, that's just too slow. So a lot of times we will need to read and write data from and to files. So this next section is a pretty important part, not just of this Java class, but of programming in general. And so we've got files. Files, you got to open them. You write information to the file and then you close them. There's two basic types of files, binary and text. A very common one that we use in a lot of programming is just writing to and from text files. Okay, so to open a file, we're going to create something called the print writer class. If we want to write text to it. So print writer output file is equal to new print writer, and then we enter the name of the file. A quick aside here is that when you're dealing with the problems or exercises in Gaddis that deal with writing and reading files, they aren't going to work in REPL IT because REPL IT is something that runs in your browser, so it can't access your local file system. However, go ahead and put the code in there just like you would normally, and then I can copy it to my local machine and grade it and so forth, just like we've been doing with the JOption pane up to this point in the class. Okay, so the print writer class, once we've used that class and we have access to the file, we can use the print and the print line methods. They're very similar to the methods we're already using to output information to the console log, except in this case, instead of inputting it or outputting it to the console log, we're just outputting it to the actual file. So a quick example, we open a file here called names.txt. Then we print 3 statements. Chris, Catherine, and Jean, you can see print line. Print line means that we're doing a carriage return and we are going to the next line. If we just do straight print, we'll get those 3 names in a row. But print line will get Chris on line 1, Catherine on line 2, Jean on line 3, and then once we're finished writing to the file, we close it. In order to access the functionality for the print writer, we've got to import the java.io library or series of libraries. And you guys, I'm sure, have seen these, but if we have an issue with our code or with reading or writing the file, we are going to see exceptions. And a lot of times the exception thrown will show us the line number that failed and so forth. So a lot of information can be derived when we see exceptions. We haven't really talked about them too much. How to deal with exceptions we will actually handle a little bit later in the class. But it's a typical thing that we would see, especially because it has to do with access. Do we have the right kind of access? Are we allowed to write to this file? Is the file present? Are we allowed to read the file? And then we can actually define exception types. If we want to read a file, but let's say the file is not there, we can actually, Java itself can throw exceptions, but we can also create our own exceptions. We can actually define them. In this case, we can throw an IO exception, which relates to input-output. And that can give the user specific information if they're using our program and trying to access a file. And we throw an IO exception, it tells them the information about the missing file or the file permissions that they would need to know. In some cases, we don't just want to create a new file, we want to open an existing file and edit it. If we want to do that, we would use the file writer object. Once we've opened the file, then we'd use the print writer that we just talked about to actually write information to the file, new information. So if we want to read data from a file, instead of write, we would open the file or create a new one. Then we'd use the same scanner object that we've been using thus far. The scanner object we've used thus far to read input from the user in the console, in the terminal. But that same scanner object can be used to read information from a file as well. So you can see here we're going to use the scanner on the top line there to actually do our standard keyboard input, and we are going to get a file name from the user. Then we're going to create a new file with the name that we entered, and then we are actually going to read that file. So we notice we used the scanner two different ways. We used it to read information from the keyboard, and then we also used it to read information from the file. And once we've created that scanner class, we can use the same methods that we used to read information from the keyboard input to read information from the file. So example here, we've got the file, we have the second line there is the scanner class, and then to read a line from the file, we would access the file, input file, dot next line. And you guys are familiar with that so far, and that next line would get the next line of text from the user. But in this case, it's going to be getting the next line from the file that we're reading. And if we have an issue with permissions or if a file is not present, we can get that IO exception, input-output exception. We talked about this earlier, but we need to be able to know when we get to the end of a file. And there's a hasNext method on the scanner that we essentially use within a while loop. It's a condition. And as long as hasNext is true, we can continue to read the file. When hasNext is false, that essentially means we've reached that character at the end of the file that tells us that we're there. Once we've done that, then that last line is input file.close, close the file. And then there's a few other topics here, but I'm not going to go over them, generating numbers with the random class. Basically what I wanted to show is that this is an important part of the class where we learn how to open a file, create a new file, open a file, read from a file, and then also write to files. You'll have one or two exercises this week that deal with that. Thank you guys, and feel free to email me with any questions.